we're getting into conversations for today. And our guest is here this morning. And we're going to be looking at, it's Katiba Day, of course. Looking at 14 years after the promulgation of the Constitution. And the future of the 2010 Constitution is what we're discussing this morning. And our guest, Oliver Waindi, who's the Executive Director of Uraia Trust, here this morning. Oliver, good morning.
Morning to you.
Karibu sana.
Thank you very much.
A lot to discuss 14 years after the promulgation. Today is Katiba Day. Many questions being asked. But before we get into it, since you're here in the hot seat to talk about such things, let's tell you today's proverb. CT has these proverbs. He'll let you know what that is, and then you can tell us what it means to you, how you would interpret it. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Our proverbs for the whole of this week come from the People's Republic of Algeria. Not just Republic, People's Republic. The proverb: there is an excess of familiarity at the root of all hostility.
Absolutely. I mean, it's basically what we want to discuss this morning, because when you're familiar to somebody, the most likely person to take advantage of you is normally the person that is very familiar to you. And that is possibly what we want to look at this morning, because I think the 54 million Kenyans in this republic probably have been taken advantage of by people that they're very familiar with. So I think it's really spot on. So it's not only Algerian. I think it's rooted in Algeria, but I think it's a very Kenyan scenario indeed. Yeah,
indeed. Okay, interesting. So here we are, 14 years after the promulgation of the Constitution 2010. And there are many questions already. Full implementation of the Constitution, is it even possible? Or are we saying, have we even started to abide by the tenets of the Constitution and seen that working through Kenya? Even as we go into some specific questions and then point in some areas, an overview of how Kenya has done with its most recent Constitution. It's 14 years down the line. Today was the day when that huge flag was hoisted, right, over Uhuru Park. And they said this is the supreme law now, and this is how Kenya will be governed. How has Kenya done under that constitution, in your opinion, Oliver, in the last 14 years?
Thank you very much. Well, I don't think we should just look at it exclusively in the context of 14 years per se, but we can stretch history back to where we've come from. And indeed, when you look at it from the history of this country, where we were until that wonderful day on 27th of August 2010, again to date, then you will see the progress we've made as a country. It is very easy to be clouded and to be blinded by the challenges we have currently and think that probably we've not made any progress. However, if you look at it where we were, for those who were there in the 1960s, like you, and those who grew up in the 70s and 80s, then you do understand that the terrain was much rougher for Kenyans when it comes to constitutionalism. And because of the setbacks that we had as a country, then, of course, we did what we did in the 2000s, and we got our constitution in 2010. Now, from 2010, of course, we got this wonderful constitution, which has really been globally acclaimed. The challenge, of course, we have is then how have we gone insofar as the implementation of the same is concerned. And indeed, I must say that the promise that we had with the Constitution and the performance that we've had, the gap is absolutely glaring, and that's what we ought to address as a country. Yes.
You know, when you say that, as you're speaking, when you talk about the 60s, you'd be surprised at where my mind went to. I actually began my early schooling in my neck of the woods, the original place we came from. It's a place called Katolo. It's in a place called Nyando. And I went to a primary school called Yogo Primary School. Now, Yogo Primary School, there were two sessions. There are those who went to school in the morning, then there are those who went to school in the afternoon. I was the group of people who went to school in the afternoon. And the reason was there were only two classes. and some people learned under a tree. And we walked to school barefooted. And I was thinking, my parents had bought us shoes, my sister and I, but we couldn't wear it because some of our teachers didn't have shoes. Okay? Now, I was thinking of relatives who wore shoes for the first time when they were in their adolescence, and the shoes gave them a problem because their feet had been accustomed to walking without shoes. And this constitution and applying it to our life reminds me of that. When you've been used to doing things the way we were socialized, and then you bring in this new thing which tries to now make lives better, the shoe is supposed to protect your foot, but you're used to walking without shoes. So the shoes now, as you put them on, become a problem instead of being what it is. So as you said that, that's what came to my mind. Shoes for the first time in your adolescence, when you haven't been wearing it, and the process of getting your feet used to wearing the shoes. That, in my opinion, is the analogy I can draw with the Constitution and how we Kenyans are.
Absolutely. What you're trying to say is that probably the speed with which you are expecting to implement it to bring the change that, like you're saying it, we were walking barefoot until 27th of August. All of a sudden we get these shoes. And then we find it too beautiful, too comfortable. And like you're putting it rightly, in the 60s then you even had fear of actually putting on that shoes. Probably that's what we've experienced as a country because we had schedules, we had everything, and our expectation was that by now would have made extremely big strides in so far as the implementation is concerned. Now, the fact that that has not been the case, I don't know if it's by design or it's just by some default, but we find ourselves here. And that is what we need to interrogate as a generation, as a country, at such a time like this.
Is there a need to celebrate this day?
Absolutely, absolutely. Remember, the challenges we are experiencing are very teething. And the sentiment on the ground, as they say, is that the Kenyan people on the ground are really enthusiastic about this constitution. That alone is a reason to celebrate it. Now, when we have people in power who are supposed to implement it and who are inherently declining to do what the Constitution wants, they're the minority. And I think the majority ultimately will have the success over this Constitution. So we've got every reason to celebrate it. And indeed, even with the challenges that we've had, it's important also to just celebrate the milestones that we've achieved. The devolution that we've had in this country, the freedom that we can even discuss this. Those are liberties that have been given to us by this Constitution that we indeed need to celebrate. So we've got a lot of things to celebrate. However, we set the bar so high in terms of our expectation, and the fact that we've not necessarily achieved the high expectation that we wanted with this Constitution, that is where the frustration comes in.
Let me ask you, is it not a good thing to set a high bar?
It is absolutely a very, very good thing.
Yes.
But I think the infrastructure must allow you to achieve that high bar. But as it is right now, clearly, that has not been the case in terms of putting structures to achieve that high bar success. And that is what is bothering us. First, as a sector, second, as a country, third, as a generation, people are getting almost discouraged, if I may use the more diplomatic word, why we can't be what we ought to be by 2024.
But did we understand, or did somebody who probably understands these things better give us a roadmap and tell us what it is that we were going to undergo before we actually achieve what was and still is aspirational?
Well, let me just say that change is not so easy to get in anything, whether it's at a personal level, institutional level, country level, or even generational level. Change is a very, very hard thing to do. Good or bad, change is a very difficult thing to achieve because you've got status quo and you've got people who have benefited from status quo, and therefore they always want to perpetuate the same. And therefore, the real challenge we have right now is the desire for the majority of Kenyans to get this thing implemented and to get a better life. And there are people who find that extremely difficult, because when you get a liberated people who can have a better say in a better life, then they want to be very easy to control in terms of politics. And I think that is where the dilemma is. It's a huge conundrum as a country that we're facing right now. Those who are holding on to the status quo and don't want to have full implementation of this constitution, and the desire of the 54 million of us in this territory called Kenya to get to implement this constitution. That is the conundrum.
Well, let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
Today I'm talking a great deal because this thing is important to me. There's a disconnect between what we have on paper and what is promised, and getting the people to actually believe that it is possible for it to happen. Because sometimes the pushback is not visible. There is a term that is used by psychologists. They call it a passive-aggressive approach to something. Somebody says yes, but they're not moving. Said yes, I am coming, but they haven't moved an inch. When you have lofty ideas like the ones we have in our constitution, and yet people have what we call their lived reality, to connect the two sometimes is a bit of a problem, because people tend to rely on what they're used to, what they're accustomed to seeing. They're comfortable with it. Even if it is something that isn't necessarily good for them, they're comfortable with it. So when you want to move them from there, they're hesitant. They're not sure. But what I'm also not sure of is, one, do we know the efforts that must be made to get people to be sure, or at least begin that journey? Do we also know what it is that we need to do in minute details to begin this process, that people can actually see this change incrementally? I dare say we've seen change, but do we communicate that what we see and what we now take for granted is the change that we're talking about? It's just that it may not have come packaged the way we would have preferred it or wanted it to be packaged, and yet the change is actually with us, as you correctly put it. That we have in this discussion itself is a huge change.
Absolutely. You are right. Maybe it's the packaging, maybe it's the communication, but I think ultimately the reason I'm putting on this shirt today is because symbolically this is what we call in this country Wanjiko. And this actually means that everything that we do, the person that ought to understand, the person who ought to partake everything that we do as a country, and those who are privileged to be in positions of power and ensuring that the constitution is successfully implemented, is this person. So if you have an implementation that is not appreciated on the ground, then that implementation itself is faulty in a way. And so it doesn't matter whether it is well communicated or well packaged. Ultimately, and that's why we begin by talking about the sovereignty of the people of this republic. The central person to this is the citizen. Actually, that's where the word Uraia is coming from.
Yeah.
It's Uraia, it's the Raia who ought to actually partake of what everything is. So it's not about the presidency explaining to us what has been achieved in terms of it is the least of us who must understand that this thing has impacted him or her. If that is not the case, then there's a problem, either in the packaging, like you're saying, or in communicating that success or otherwise. Yeah.
So what are some of the activities that we see or that you've been involved in that would then point directly to ensuring that, number one, the citizen, even if it is at the very basic level, has understanding of what this constitution is and how you can then insist on the implementation of it by those who've been given the responsibility? How? What are some of the things that we see that gets us closer to that mark?
Well, let me just say, and Ken is a lawyer, he knows that better than me, that it is the responsibility of the government to actually carry out civic education. Civic education is basically educating the masses on their rights and responsibilities in this country. So it is the role of the government. However, we supplement it in our sector. So we actually carry out civic education, trying to help Kenyans understand what their rights are and indeed what their responsibilities are as well. Now, once a population is well educated on its rights and responsibilities, sooner or later they will start to do the right things, demand for their rights, but as well get accountable for the actions of demanding for the rights. So what we have seen, for example, of the past few months specifically, and indeed much longer before, we are seeing agitation. That in itself is a manifestation that Kenyans are getting aware of what their rights are. You have seen the Gen Zs from the 25th of June this year, and when they're arrested, they proudly display our Constitution booklet and saying, no, this is not right according to the Constitution. None of them is a lawyer. Because, again, we have to debunk this and demystify that the Constitution is a legal document. This is a contract between those who are in leadership and the 54 million Kenyans.
Yes.
And we want it to be operationalized and be understood by the least of us. One of the challenges, again, that we've had over the past 14 years is the assumption that, only lawyers ought to understand this,
yes,
and then interpret it on our behalf. And we want to really make this simple, widespread, to permit every corner of this country, just asking people to be responsible citizens, upholding their rights, demanding what is rightfully theirs, but at the same time, carrying out their duties as responsible citizens of this country. Now, I am glad to say that we are gradually seeing that getting manifested in our country, both in terms of people partaking the processes that we have, even democratic processes. Okay, we've had issues of less and less people participating in election, which we're trying to address through civic education. But we are glad that more and more people are now getting bolder in demanding for what they think is their right. Now, we saw it in the town hall 2 days ago when university students were telling the president, no, we are not okay with this new university model. Now, I don't know the viability of that. All what I know is that when a young 22-year-old stands and tells the president, I disagree with you on that, that alone tells you that there is more awareness in terms of what people believe is the right. And that is what makes me happy as a person and makes me happy as a Kenyan, that we are getting a generation that can hold people accountable and can ask for what is rightfully theirs. There
have been some accusations that have come from government in terms of involvement by non-governmental organizations when it comes to some of the things that you talk about. Civic education, number one. And like you said, it's a purview of government. But then you've been filling the holes. But there seems to be wide gaping holes in terms of some of these things. So there has been direct accusation from government that, non-governmental organizations are poking their nose where it doesn't concern them. What's your take on that, and how ought it to be?
Well, like he said at the beginning, change is very hard to get. And when change is brought, it's going to cause a lot of disquiet and discomfort to those in power. That is not something that they would want to see. The sector that I work in is probably one of the most patriotic sector you can ever get, because all what we want is the best for this country. Nobody in his right senses would want to destroy a country that he is or she is in by God's own design. So, I mean, it would be very foolish of any of us to do that. We want the best for our country. But when we do that, the only way to do it is to make it very uncomfortable for people who don't want us to have a good country. And when you make it uncomfortable, and they have continuously benefited from the chaos and the ugly side of the implementation of this constitution, they will be in the forefront of saying that you are not necessarily doing what they want, which is what they want, not what the constitution wants and what the Kenyans want. So yes, I am aware that we have been accused variously of not necessarily being very patriotic and always dancing to the tune of the outsiders, which is really far-fetched. What we want and what we do is to ask Kenyans to be responsible citizens. And you know, in Uraia, for example, which is the lead organization when it comes to civic education, the only gospel we preach is that we are all here by God's design. It is your responsibility to make Kenya better for all of us. So you've got rights that you must demand, but you also have got duties and responsibilities that you ought to uphold as citizens of this country. Now, if that is bad gospel, then I don't know what is. Yeah, because all what you're telling Kenyans is, please don't do anything that you're not supposed to do, but do everything that you ought to do.
Supposed to do.
Now, if that is agitation, well, I think I'm in the presence of a lawyer. You can tell me whether that is an agitation. But nobody in his right senses would be happy when status quo is getting changed.
Oliver Waindi is our guest this hour, and we're looking at Constitution 2010, what it means in 2024. Ken?
Olive, good to see you. I know we've had a lot of discussions about the Constitution, and you sit at a very unique place. You have to study and understand the Constitution, and then you have to use your knowledge to impact Kenyans using your organization. I'm looking at the Constitution 14 years later, and most parts have been litigated. And we have understood the Constitution because of the several constitutional applications that have been made in court. But my understanding, there's still parts that have not been tested or even stretched. But I wish to know this morning, from where you sit at that unique place, do you think it's time that Kenyans rethought this Constitution?
It is difficult to rethink something that you've not even implemented, because that's precisely where the challenge is. There's been that school of thought that probably we need to rethink about the Constitution. But there's also another school of thought that asks, why do we have to even rethink about changing something that we've not even implemented? And that is the big dilemma we have, Ken. My suggestion is that we just need a full throttle approach in implementing this Constitution. We cannot fault something that has not been fully implemented. I mean, there are basic things, for example, like this Constitution. I mean, the very essence of it, of course, was the defense of the minority, talking about the minority, the people living with disabilities. These people are still where they were, probably worse than 2010. When you talk about the two-third gender rule that was proposed way back, now I do understand the gymnastics around it and why it's difficult to achieve it. But that is precisely what we need to discuss as a country. What can we do to get this parity that was suggested in the Constitution? We cannot just talk about, let's just shelve it like it was being discussed here some time back, because democracy is democracy. We have to go further. Remember, the Constitution is made for Kenyans. It's not the other way around. And so it is important that this Constitution address the aspirations of Kenyan people. When we talked about two-thirds, there was a reason for the framers to say that. When we talk about the defense for the people, for people living with disability, generally in the minority, there was a reason for that. And it is incumbent upon us as a generation to ensure that that is implemented. Now, the escapist would then say, no, this is too much. 14 years down the line, we ought to change this because this is not working. Now, it is true because, Constitution is not frozen in time because it has to evolve with the ebbs and flows of life. And therefore, one way or the other, we still need to work on areas that we think need to be worked on. That is not in question. But what is in question is the wholehearted approach in implementing this Constitution. And not only implementing it, but actually living it. Remember, you as a lawyer, you are aware that there is this famous judge, Antonin, who said even banana republics have constitutions and have got bills of right. The bigger problem is, how do you live it out? So we have a big problem of having something written and something implemented and lived and internalized by Kenyans. So let's not talk about rethinking anything. Let's just have the right people, right mindset, and right architecture and right ecosystem to actually implement this constitution. This constitution is extremely good. I am not a lawyer. You are. But I can tell you as a non-lawyer that if you go through all the 18 articles that we have, this is probably the best constitution that this country can ever get.
Okay. So yesterday we had a whole conversation about Schedule 5 here. So if you missed it, you might just want to catch it from YouTube. But this constitution has also, just picking from where you've left, been touted as the most progressive. And you've just said it. It's one of the best constitutions. The problem is in the taste. It's the implementation of this constitution. And we can increasingly see how Kenyans have become aware, thanks to organizations like yours and others that have made it a point to educate Kenyans, and thanks to lawyers who've often gone to court, for interpretations for public interest. They've often gone to court. There's a lot of awareness to this. Now, when this constitution, just before the promulgation, I remember I was also in Naivasha. I was just a rookie, just joined journalism. I used to make all those trips to Great Rift and the rest. It was said to be a negotiated document. And 30% could have been bad, 70% could have been good. Now, on the point of being a progressive document, from where you sit, having tried and tested this, who is the weakest link in the implementation, having spoken about the implementation being the problem? Who could be the weakest link? Is it the judiciary? Is it the enablers of the constitution, the subsidiary legislations from parliament? Is it the wananchi and their interest in their constitution? Who is the weakest? Is it the politicians who negotiated for their benefits? Because they said, sometimes you want to put something in there that you think benefits you, but then suddenly things turn around and you realize you're no longer where it benefits. Now you're on the receiving end. So who would that be?
Well, who that be, I will answer, but I will start by, first of all, excluding wananchi, because wananchi are not part and parcel of this. They are the victims of this thing not getting implemented. So who has not done his part in terms of implementing this constitution? I would say that probably the executive carries the biggest responsibility. Obviously, because we have people in this executive who are obviously against this constitution, that notwithstanding anyway. The actual implementation of this constitution, if it got the support it did, that it required from the executive, would be much more easier. Let me just use examples that we've seen recently, things that are obviously out of this constitution. For example, what has just happened right now between the merger, quote unquote, between the ODM and the ruling party, that alone is killing the spirit of multipartyism, which is part and parcel of what we talk about in terms of representation, and which is very explicit in our constitution. That only happened because the executive wanted it. But Article 38 explicitly also gives you the right to associate with whoever you want to. It's in the constitution. Yes, absolutely. That's what I'm saying, because the executive has got almost veto power. They can exercise that better than anybody else. So I am saying that the fact that they've got this power, it is therefore important for them to actually exercise it with much more humility to uphold this constitution, which has not happened. So it's not everything that you do that is right. Everything that you do rightly is necessarily doing the right thing. And that is what ought to happen. So I feel that the executive, on paper, really mean good for this constitution. But in practice, we've had to have a lot of question marks in terms of their commitment to implementing this.
And you've seen the biggest load.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And
because we
Parliament-
are in a presidential.
and Parliament. What about Parliament? Because a lot of enablers of this constitution should have come from Parliament.
Yeah.
Yes, but you see, and I'm sorry to say this, that that is why even the assumption that Parliament is an appendage of the executive is exactly that, because you have seen, for example, the finance bill that we had that became an act and that caused all mayhem in our country, emanated from the Parliament, but it did so on the behest of the executive. So I am saying that our Parliament is almost important, but the importance has been well brought about by the executive's interference of the same.
Okay.
And that's why I'm saying that it is important for the executive to take, to have a relook on itself, on what it can do about this, and to let each and every part of the four of the three arms of government to be independent. So far, it's not.
If you look at it, maybe with a little bit more scrutiny, why would any executive, doesn't matter where you are in the world, why wouldn't you want to implement, or why wouldn't you want to foster an environment whereby a supreme law would be implemented? Because if you look at how it came about, Kenyans around the country contributed to this, and it was what would make sense for everyone. So why would you be against the implementation of the same thing that would be put in place to safeguard Kenyans?
Yes, and that's a very good question. But remember, and that's why I talked about at the beginning of people who are used to the status quo. The status quo in our country and in our continent and in our generation has a lot of benefits. You can acquire land anywhere. You can literally rob our country of any amount of money that you want from the exchequer. You can do anything with that power. So when you've got an enlightened population, then it becomes a problem for you. And I'm not saying that's the case in our case. I'm just giving a hypothetical situation. When you've got an empowered people, then it becomes a problem for you to retain your status quo and the related benefits. And by the way, this is not new in our, even this women empowerment, which we as a sector and as an organization is really trying to propagate, is causing a lot of issues with the boy child, with the male people outside there, because they're saying that we are trying to incite their wives. But you forget that when you got a wife who is empowered, it is best for you, it's best for the family, it's best for the community. But for those who fear and who have had this power, which is generational, then have a problem trying to relate to that when you got people that initially depended on you in terms of decision, in terms of their destiny being shaped, depended on you, now all of a sudden want that to be owned by themselves, it's not very pleasant for them. And they will fight. And this is not beginning with our generation. It's not beginning with our executive right now. It has been a long, almost human history, long challenge for people who are in power to let go.
Yeah.
But let go, it will happen. Because a time is going to come, wanavyosema Waswahili, kuwa wengi wape, usipowapa watachukua wenyewe. And we really don't want to get there. There's a reason why framers sat down and got us these 18 articles. And it is incumbent upon you to actually implement it. Now, if you don't want, if there is a problem with it, and that's what George Washington said in the American Constitution, that they will make it very hard for it to be amended. But if amendment ought to happen, then it has to be people-driven and not elite-driven, like we've seen with BBI, like we saw with NADCO. We really don't want that. We want a situation where this thing belongs to Kenyans. It doesn't belong to the politicians. It doesn't belong to the lawyers. It doesn't belong to the pastors. This document belongs to the 54 million Kenyans that were there on 27th day of August 2010, that are here today, that will be here long after we are all gone. And it's important for us that we are able to bequeath the next generation of a document that we found and held in sacred and actually handed it over to them. As it is right now, that is not the case, and we can't allow that as a sector, as a generation, as a leadership of this organization.
You know what I find interesting? You know, we keep talking about tinkering with the Constitution. Perhaps even if the leaders or the political leadership were serious about the Constitution and the benefit that the citizenry can derive from it, I want to dare suggest that perhaps they should rejig the Commission of the Implementation of the Constitution again, because that was, this is a pet subject of mine anyway. Because if you don't have a commission, we have a commission for everything in this country, except the most important thing and the thing that we are forever grappling with. We had this discussion yesterday. Up until the time when we know that the Constitution has been operationalized, because that is the fight, isn't it? How do you interpret this? What does this mean? And we are forever going to the Supreme Court with these things here. If any executive, any government was serious, we would get a commission that actually deals singularly and solely with the Constitution and how it is that it should be implemented. Because so long as we have that in limbo, then it means that the power structures that have existed in the past will continue dominating. Because with the Constitution that we still have a situation where those in power behave as though we don't have a new Constitution. They actually do exactly what they want. They will disregard court orders, clean. They will go against the Constitution, again, clean, for you to work in broad, it's not at night, in broad daylight. And the problem is, one doesn't see the consequences that should follow. Now, but if indeed we understood all the tenets that deal with the Constitution and the implementation of the very aspects that minutely specify what would happen in the event of the abrogation of the said Constitution, very many people will be very reluctant to try and go against it.
Right.
But as things stand now, it's open season. The court pronounces it itself. Those in power simply ignore the courts.
It seems like there needs to be a tightening of screws, in certain areas. I mean, again, coming off a couple of conversations that we've had recently, and to say that, look, if truly that the security that has been set up to ensure that this happens were actually tightened, then people would be almost forced to live within the tenets of the Constitution. But it seems as though it's free for all. You can do whatever you want.
There are no consequences.
There are no consequences.
At least there are consequences.
There's a supreme law, but there's no supremacy that's being put in it.
60 years ago, or more than 60 years ago, Martin Luther King was talking about the U.S. Constitution, and he said that there were three enemies to that Constitution. And the more you look at it and the more you interrogate the statements, the more you literally see our situation in what he said in the 50s. He talked about the enemies of the Constitution then being racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. And that's what we're seeing here. Now, we don't have racism, but we've got negative ethnicity. We've got economic exploitation, and we've got militarism. And you can see it here that the oligarchs, those who are in power, would use these three to actually perpetuate the threat to our Constitution. When you talk about negative ethnicity, and you've seen it, where, for example, the very nature, the very base of our Constitution was about protecting the minorities. And you've seen how much we still have kids in Turkana, in Northeastern, who are still going to school under a tree, almost 65 years after our independence.
Right.
We have seen 400 out of every 100,000 kids born die. We have seen teachers still going to strike every 2 or 3 years because they're not paid. And that is, collectively, a big challenge to the implementation and the internalization and the living of this new Constitution. Then the economic exploitation. And you've seen it now over the past few weeks, and we also it in the country, where they collect a lot of money and they use it to literally buy the loyalty of people across the country. And therefore, that would not be possible if people were economically empowered. So the less empowered the population is, the better it is to control using resources. And militarism, we've all seen it, where you go out doing what is actually prescribed in the Constitution, and you literally get killed.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, in 1 year, we've lost close to 300 people in the streets. And the worst part is that we don't even know how many exactly we've lost. And these are not just statistics. These are people's husbands, people's wives, brothers and sisters. And we're just moving on as a country as if it's no big deal. And so I'm saying that the normalcy with which we've taken our challenges is baffling and should not be accepted.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you see? Excuse me, if you were to look into a proverbial crystal ball, I mean, and I guess it's a sum of everything that has happened over the last 14 years. What would you see moving forward in terms, because I mean, many have touted it as it's a good constitution. You yourself has said it. There are many things there that are fantastic in terms of the development of the Kenyan people, its sovereignty and, all of this statesmanship. What would you say would look like in the near future with all these ingredients that we see right now, non-compliance, goodwill or not?
Well, I would use the biblical analogy of going up to the mountaintop and looking across the land there, and it's a beautiful land. From the top, I can see a beautiful land called Kenya. Nothing gives me more hope than seeing our young people, including our sons and daughters, asking for what is the right. That gives me a lot of hope. When you see Gen Zs doing what they did, I don't advocate for violence, I don't advocate for lawlessness, but it gives me a lot of pleasure when I see people saying, this is our country, and we'll do everything else to make it better. That gives me a lot of hope. I'm also seeing a lot of hope seeing more and more people getting elected and getting into areas of influence. I desire to see a country where a generation is going to come that will not look like Martin Luther King said, where you came from, but indeed the content of your character. I'm seeing hope. I'm seeing a generation that will come and implement this constitution, and not only implement it, but live it. I am seeing a situation and remember, when we talk about the future, we are not just necessarily talking about the constitution in exclusion.
Right.
We are looking at it as the bedrock of what we want to do: the economics, the politics, the social structures, and that is what, therefore, we come in to do as Uraia. Because one thing that we've realized is that everybody seems to be knowing the constitution. The problem is how to live it.
Yes.
And that is why our emphasis now going forward now becomes Utu. Utu has become the key word that we want to permeate this country with. We want to, knock every door, talk about Utu. And Utu is as biblical, is as Quran, is as Veda as it goes. Because it all goes as, do unto others what you want to be done unto you.
Yeah.
And love thy neighbor as you love thyself. If we only implemented that, then there will be no need for this constitution. Remember, they said, I think it is, I think it was George Washington who said that if angels lived in this world, then we would not need any constitution. And if angels ruled over this world, then we would not need constitution either.
You said George Washington?
I think it's George Washington.
We assume he had seen some angels. Huh?
Yes. But generally, what it means is that we are living in this world, and apart from things getting written in a constitution, it's how I relate to you. I don't need anything in the constitution to respect you as a human being.
Right.
I don't need anything to be written not to steal his phone or your phone or your phone.
Exactly.
So there are things that are written, right? But I think it's just common sense. It's just a decorum requirement that we live like human beings ought to live. And that's why we are now saying, beyond the constitution, how do we make people just be good to one another? How do we make people to live as human beings? And therefore, Utu is becoming the catchphrase that we are saying.
Yeah.
It's originating from the word Ubuntu.
Yeah.
That, okay, let's forget about everything written. Can we just be good to one another?
And just treat each other right.
Absolutely.
Fantastic way to end on this morning. It is Katiba Day, 14 years after the promulgation of the Constitution 2010. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but that there's also something that we can do one to another in terms of humanity. Oliver Waindi is the Executive Director of Uraia Trust. He's been our guest this hour. More conversations to be had. But thank you for being in the hot seat this morning. Until we talk again.
This is The Situation Room, the only way to start your day.